Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today's episode 12 of our secular Bible study series. Today we're looking at 2 Kings. This is an interesting book. There's quite a bit that happens here that we haven't covered yet. I will say that when I was covering 1 Kings, I covered a ton of what probably should have been covered in 2 Kings. And really knowing that this is the same book and it was just divided into for scroll length, I'm not going to recover things like literary techniques, authorship and date, even some of the historical context. Some of those things might have some unique points, but generally speaking, we're going to major in the majors here. We're going to talk about what the rest of this book summarizes, what events happen that we need to know as we go forward in the Old Testament. The main themes of this book, if they're different than 1 Kings, the reception and influence, and again, point 7 with all of the contradictions, errors, and problematic passages. So again, maybe a shorter one for you, although sometimes I say that and it ends up being a longer one. I really just don't know. Let's dive in. Where did we leave off in 1 Kings? Well, King Ahab had just died, I believe, and Elijah was on the scene doing major miracles with a disciple of his own, Elisha, who we will see will be taking over here in 2 Kings. So 2 Kings starts off almost immediately in chapter 2 with Elijah being taken to heaven. This is one of the most monumental scenes in all of the Bible. Why Elijah got such special preference here seems a little bit vague, but the story itself is really interesting. If you just read chapter 2, it's a little bit frustrating. Elijah and Elisha essentially are arguing from town to town about if he's going to leave him behind here, and he says, no, where you go, I'll go. And people say, you know, you're going to lose him, right? And every time he just says, keep quiet. And it's this weird exchange until finally Elisha asks Elijah, knowing that the end is near, can you give me a double portion of what God has given you, or can you have God do that for me? Again, still going through the main prophet here. And Elijah says, you've asked a lot, but here's what we'll do. If you see me when God takes me, then know that it will be so, but if you don't, then it won't. Which is pretty funny to me that it can never just be a yes or a no. Like, doesn't Elijah know what God's going to do here? Isn't that his entire point as like lead prophet, is to speak for God? But okay. And even while they're having this conversation, bam, chariots of fire and the whirlwind, the whole deal comes and sucks him up and takes him off. And Elisha is so pleased because this means his answer is yes, he gets a double portion. And why does he want this? It seems that he wants to be great, not necessarily do great things for God, but I won't try to assign him motive. It's just interesting that he doesn't ask for wisdom, he asks for power, and not just the same power that already the most powerful prophet yet has had, but double it. It's a very strange request. And what does he do with his magical powers? The very first thing he does is he just makes more food for everyone. That's his first miracle. So we get 14 recorded miracles in this book for Elisha versus the 7 that we got in 1 Kings for Elijah. So the authors are working hard here to show the double portion. And some of them, again, are a little bit of a reach. If you don't like the food one, there's another one where he's with some guys who are cutting down trees, and one of them drops the head of his axe into the water, and he says, oh no, this was borrowed, it's not mine. And Elijah's like, I got this. And he throws his little magical stick in the pond, and where the stick goes, the iron axe head raises up and floats in the water so that this guy can find it. So yeah, double miracles, but are they as important? Well, some of them are. He heals some leprosy. He raises a kid from the dead. So again, it's so strange that we had to throw in these other like weird baby miracles. The whole scene to me is this reminiscent, you can almost picture Lord of the Rings, like these two old wizards talking together until one of them just ascends into another realm and the other one strips off his clothes, tears them off him, and puts on Elijah's cloak, the grand wizard's cloak, now with his double power. It's just so mythological as opposed to theological, I guess. Like, wouldn't the whole point of these books be to help us know our God better, to love our God, to serve our God? And yes, there would be some narrative story in there, but the details that seem important to these authors do not seem like the details that are important to the Christian church today. And this ever-growing separation between the foundation of the religion and where it's at now, I can't not see it. So the next few parts here will move forward at a better speed. We get all the miracles of Elisha, and then we get a succession of kings introduced. And it starts with Jehu, who starts out good, even though I think it's terrible, but good in God's eyes as he absolutely decimates Ahab's family to take power. But then, like every single leader, king, or judge, he does what they all do with a little bit of power, and he goes overboard. So he does all these horrendous things that God likes, then he keeps doing horrendous things, and God says, that's too many horrendous things. kings. And this goes on person after person after person after person after person until finally we move outside of these noble Israelites and we see Assyria take over. And this is a huge part of the book. This happens in chapter 17. And remember, we have the split kingdoms. The northern kingdom with Samaria as its capital gets taken by the Assyrians. Now they are exiled out. They're taken to a place called Halah in the Medes, and many of them are scattered all around. We haven't had this for this people group since they were back in Egypt. And since this time, they've been the conquerors. They've been the destroyers. They've had some times where they've been the underdog. They've had some times where they lost privileges. They have some times where they've been oppressed, but never like this, especially since David established the kingdom. I should point out that it's clear at the end of 17, we understand why this happens to the northern kingdom. It's because they were going against the commands of the law and because of the idol worship, which is interesting because we have seen those two things happen since the very beginning. So why now is God turning his back to this degree? The southern kingdom is holding out still. The Assyrians actually do go down and try to invade the southern kingdom, but Hezekiah, who's one of the good kings of the southern kingdom, one could argue that though, but his faithfulness holds them back. Then we get a very bad king with Manasseh. He is all about more idols, more pagan gods from the Canaanites, etc. Then we get one more good king with Josiah, who finds an old ancient scroll somewhere in the temple and is like, look, this stuff is true. We've got to cut out all this idol worship. But it's too little, too late, because here comes Babylon. And man, is this epic. This is everything you think of with ancient battles. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon takes up his entire army, or a vast amount of it, it says, and goes and starts to lay siege on Judah. The siege lasted, again, it kind of depends on how you read the text there, but it seems like well over a year, maybe a year and a half, until finally the city is starving. All the guards run out by night. They get conquered down in Jericho. The rest of the city gets sacked. They destroy the temple. They take the people into exile, take them to Babylon, and that's that. So, how is God going to fulfill all of his promises? Is it over for Israel here? This is a really kind of cliffhanger for the story that we haven't really seen before. We see some allusions that other things are documented in First Chronicles, and we get maybe one of the strangest endings to any of the biblical books. It's just a paragraph long. It's skipped forward almost 4 full decades, and we see Jehoiakim, who would have been the future king. He was in the line of David, and he's been imprisoned this entire time, like 37 or 39 years, whatever it is. And the king of Babylon at this time takes him out of his enslavement, puts him at a table. He eats with him for the rest of his days, he says. He's elevated above the status of others. And it's this very weird, what's happening here? Is God starting to show favor again to the people of Israel? Again, cliffhanger, very, very strange. I don't think 2 Kings typically gets enough coverage for these events. We kind of just jump around when we think about the Old Testament. We think about the time in Exodus, we think about the time in the wilderness, we think about Canaan, and then we think about Babylon. But these books, again, are just monumental. First, it's the splitting of the unification of Israel, right? We start to lose out on what David and Solomon built. We're going through 40 different kings. We're going through a very long period of time here of idol worship. We are essentially at this point no different than the Canaanite tribes that were so bad. We're child sacrificing. We have enslavement going again. We have division. We have idol worship. We're Canaanites, which we always were, by the way. But this just falls down so hard. And if all that wasn't bad enough, now we're not even a nation or a split nation. We're defeated. We lost our temple, we lost our ark, we're spread out and separated and segregated. This is huge. So I think we're going to breeze through points 2, 3, and skip 4 altogether. Really quick though, in terms of authorship, again, we have the traditional sense of did Jeremiah do it versus the scholarly sense of no, this is definitely multiple authors, a period of redaction, all kinds of things. It is interesting to note that we're getting so much closer to when so much of the Old Testament that we've covered so far was probably put together, which is this 6th century BCE during or after the Babylonian exile. So we're here. Hey, we're in the Babylonian exile. It's at this very time, maybe even during that 40 years that we see at the end of that paragraph, that a lot of this was maybe put together. Some of the thinking about why it was put together wasn't just that these were the Israelite people putting it together in secret for themselves to hold on to, but that the Babylonians wanted to be able to rule over these people better. So let's give them their own laws. Let's give them their own story here so that we can better control them and use their religion as chains, essentially. actually. That's one thought. Obviously, it's not necessarily the thought or what is accurate. And the other one is that all of this is put together after the exile when they're trying to recombine as a people group, and they want to understand their history, and they want to document the oral and written traditions that they know about, get it all in one place, and try to have some staple as themselves as a people group. Either way, we are inching ever closer to that actual point. In terms of point 3 with historical accuracy, there's not a whole lot of new information here that's addressed. We do get 2 things we can verify, and I'd be remiss if I didn't cover those as well. Most of this we can't say happened, right? Elijah going up in a whirlwind, that's just theological stuff. But we did get a name of a king of Assyria when they were conquering the capital of Samaria. That's been validated. And also just that the Assyrians took Samaria. We know that from archaeological evidence. So we're starting to get into some other factors. And again, we'll know that the Babylonian exile was also true. A lot of this was never up for debate. And by the way, where we are, just to give you some dating, because we know this thanks to, again, the good record keeping of the Assyrians, is 722 BCE seems to be the most agreed upon date where Samaria, the northern kingdom capital, was finally taken. Exactly when the Babylonian captivity happened in that siege we'll get into when we talk about Chronicles, but I think it's pretty neat to see the time frame that has happened here. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about things that happened at 1100 BC or 1400 BCE. I mean, we are really moving along now. Point 4 is just the exact same. The literary techniques here are all employed exactly the same. This was originally one book, so no need to segment this, and we don't really see anything new. So let's move straight into point 5. Main themes. Again, this is going to be similar, but I think it's worth noting. The biggest one, and bigger than ever before, is that of divine justice. God has had enough. He's shown us mercy before, over and over and over, smiting these people, killing these people, enslaving these people, whatever, but never to the full extent that we see happen in this book. It is epic. It is an actual turning of God's back. Leadership is another huge theme here. It's definitely been a theme in many of the other books, but it goes out of its way to tell us that it was the king's fault. But then, almost as if to cover the objection that would come about, well, it's so unfair that you just have leaders that want to instigate idol worship, and then the layman Israelite follows that leader and gets punished to this degree as well. They go out of their way to say the king did this, and every single person that he ruled followed him into this sin. And so we see the importance of having the right leaders who will do the right thing, and that the leadership is a reflection of the people themselves. I think that's a really interesting point. And then a third one that gets put in here a few times as we focus on some of the good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah is that of redemption. We're so close. There's still a plan here, even with what we see at the very end with that future would-be king of Judah getting a place at the table. Is God still working for these people? Is he going to fulfill his plan? Does he see the righteous like he did with Noah, like he did with Lot? And what does this redemptive plan look like despite all hopelessness? So I think I've covered point 6 pretty well so far between what we've said about it in 1 Kings and also what I just covered during main themes. I guess the biggest cultural influence that has trickled down other than the final fall of these kingdoms is that of Elijah and Elisha. These two prophets are so prolific, and just again the scene and the hope of being good enough, important enough, spiritual enough to be taken up, right? We get so much visual aspect that if he's going up must be to heaven, right? So even though this is Old Testament and typically we think of an afterlife in Sheol, down, actually it's really interesting to compare it because Samuel, when he's brought up by the necromancer to talk to Saul, he was down. He came up to meet with them from Sheol. So Elijah being taken up is very, very interesting and very significant to what would become the future concept of heaven, and in opposition to then down being bad, hell. A lot of imagery here, and this has definitely been dealt with extensively through the arts of the ages. But let's move into point 7 here and wrestle with some of the issues. The first one, just to note, if we're talking about contradictions, is just all of the timeline errors. I've mentioned this before in 1 Kings, but we have different accounts between 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and also between 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles, where we hear retellings about the same stories, the same kings, the same lifespans, the same census data that simply does not match up. The one that I meant to cover last time, and I got it confused a little bit, and I made an edit there in the description of my first Kings video, is that in 2 Kings 24:8, Jehoiakim was 18 when he became king or began to reign. But in 2 Chronicles 36:9, he's only 8 years old. Again, is this a copyist error? Sure, more than likely. Contradiction none the least. These two things cannot exist. So if you're someone who believes in biblical inerrancy, you're just out of luck. And if you're someone who doesn't care about these small details, I can understand that. Again, not a salvation issue, but it always makes me think, what else do we have wrong? I hear more and more and more in the comments all of the time. Yeah, well, I don't expect the Bible to be true. I don't expect it to be accurate. A ton of this stuff is obviously man-made. It's not like God actually wrote the Bible. Why are you holding to this so literally? And then they will turn around and defend the resurrection of Jesus as 100% literal and true. Well, how do you know? Isn't it just a few more narratives in a few books that are anonymous authors written by fallible men? How do we know that's not metaphor? It seems like that would be way more likely to be a metaphor than all of the excuses I got that are metaphor from the last 40 commands of Jesus or others in the New Testament that I just went through in those last two videos. How can you make these separations when you know that these books are forgeries? Oh, but these books aren't. And this verse was added on at the end of Mark, but the rest of Mark is definitely okay. And this is a metaphor here, but this should be taken literal. It's messy, and it's something we wouldn't expect. And so that's why I continue to point these things out. Hezekiah, again, the good king, his death is pretty interesting. It gets extended 15 years by a miracle when he prays for healing, but that doesn't line up then with what we see happen after his death in that same time frame. Sennacherib's death is a really interesting one because this is not an inter-conflict within the Bible. This is the Bible's word versus the Assyrians' word. Really fascinating that now we're getting to the point where we have other historical tellings, but from different cultures and different sources. We have another one of those at what year did this person become king, and we have two different accounts. This is for Ahaziah, and in 2 Kings it's 22, but in 2 Chronicles it's 42. Another really interesting contradiction happens with the difference of the retelling of the story from Isaiah to 2 Kings about the Assyrian attempt at the southern kingdom where Hezekiah's faith fights it off, and there's a tribute payment, and that payment is listed as something different. This next one isn't so much a contradiction. There's a misunderstanding, maybe even I've been saying it here, of Elijah went up in chariots of fire in a whirlwind. Really, the language is that chariots of fire separated Elijah from Elisha, and he was taken up in a whirlwind. And yet we see that imagery so much of him going up in chariots of fire into the sky, but very different from what the actual text says. So again, this isn't the text fault. This isn't like, oh, the Bible's not true because of this. It's just interesting that these stories get conflated and mixed up over time, and we see this referenced elsewhere as well. So just something to point out. I'll list a few more just briefly. We've got the difference in how Zedekiah's sons died, and we see this now contradicting with Jeremiah versus what's in 2 Kings. How and when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah or Jerusalem is up for debate versus if you're looking in 2 Kings versus 2 Chronicles. Did Yehu get rid of idol worship or not? This is just a few verses apart. Elisha's healings, Aram's kings, Ahab's death, Pekah's death, the Babylonian siege of Tyre. It goes on and on and on. So again, we could probably do another 25 specific contradictions, but for time, we'll just move into problematic passages. But when it comes to timelines and individuals and ages and deaths and healings, we see a mess of misinformation here. Getting into problematic passages, let's start with what has to be my favorite from the book. And it's almost so silly that it gets passed over for how horrendous it is. This is from 2 Kings 2:23 through 24, I believe. This is talking about Elisha. So setting the scene, remember, he just took over. He just put on the garments of the more powerful wizard, and a bunch of kids make fun of him and they say, "Go up, bald head." That's it. That's all they said. And he curses them. And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there, he went up to Mount Carmel. So he just carries on about his day. Killing 42 kids, gruesome deaths by 2 bears. Imagine what that scene looks like. Now, this is where I'm using it to point out that it's so silly and so absurd that a lot of the times it gets dismissed. But killing 42 children for being children and making a comment. And do you think that all 42 of them said that? So even if somehow this is a just punishment for mocking a prophet of God, there's no way that this was a just fulfillment. Again, wizard power here. Elisha turns, looks at them, and curses the lot of them. Seems like there was more than 42 and the bears only got 42. Where is God's ownership of this? Did God choose those 42? Why not 41? Why not go get that 43rd that was a little faster at running? And we have to believe this actually happened, right? If we can't believe this happened, we can't believe in any of Elijah's miracles or powers, or the prophecies that later will be pointed back to that Elisha did, said, and were fulfilled as proof that this God is true. Again, there's no metaphor for killing 42 children with bears. This is a detailed, specific verse. This isn't even one of God's favorite rounded up numbers like 7, 10, 12, 40. This is 42. We're meant to take this literally. If we take it as it's supposed to be taken literally, it is disgusting. It's child murder. This is not a good God. This is not the creator of the universe. The next one's really interesting, and I don't have all of the context needed to make a judgment on this, so I'm going to share it with you, and I'll ask you guys, what am I missing here? So we have Moab rebels against Israel. Right, so this is not Israel. This is another king, the king of Moab. And I'm going to pick up in 2 Kings 3. I'll give you a little bit of context here by going back to verse 26. When the king of Moab saw that the battle was going against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through opposite the king of Edom, but they could not. Okay, so he's tried, he's seen that it's not going well. He grabbed 700 swordsmen, said, let's do it this way, but even that doesn't work. So verse 27, then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. So child sacrifice here. And there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. From a plain reading here, what this looks like is that the people Israel was fighting sacrificed a child, which, fine. We've seen a lot of the Canaanite and surrounding people do this kind of activity. We've also seen Israel do it. Jephthah did it, and it helped him win a battle, but it seems that it helped Moab win a battle. So did God recognize that and just loves child sacrifice so much that he helped out the enemy tribe? Or did the enemy tribe have a God that liked that sacrifice that was more powerful than Yahweh that day? Or is this just coincidence, and it shows that all the Canaanites were just killing their own sons for fun during these battles to see if it would give them an upper hand? And just like anything, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. The reason I wanted to point it out is because I remember reading this as a believer and thinking, yeah, look, what a stupid thing for this enemy to be doing, giving up his own son just to try to win a battle. And as soon as it's not Israel, like the cognitive dissonance in my head was like evil, bad, corrupt, stupid, worthless. But I didn't have that reaction initially with what happened with Jephthah and Judges, or all of the other horrendous things that God has required his people to do to get victories in battle. I think it's important to point that out, and this is at my own expense here. We make excuses when we think that it's God's side, because if it's God's side, it must be the right thing. And that logic simply doesn't hold up for me anymore. And I'm hoping to point it out to those of you who still think the way I used to. But let's move on to the next one. Sometimes I like to point out just crazy verses. This one I think is a little bit nuts. Here's 2 Kings 6:18. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elijah said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. So, okay, we've seen God use a ton of magic here to help out. Blinding all of your enemies seems like a huge impediment to their free will. And it seems like Elisha here has free reign. Like whatever he says, God is going to do. So how did it still go so badly? But that's another point. It's not, though, just the blinding, which is the literal taking of free will. It's the deceit from Elisha. Now, you could say, Brandon, it's totally fair to lie in war. Okay, but if everything is so subjective, if there's always a but in this case, or if it's like this, or if it's for this tribe, I just think it starts to get beyond hazy. Elijah goes out of his way to rob these men of their free will, to intervene in the most insane way ever, blinding an entire army, leads them straight into the heart of their captors, and says, gotcha, again. Not a huge point, not a hill to die on, just insane how the God of the Old Testament works. With all of that in mind, think about this verse. And this happens just a few verses down in chapter chapter 6. Verse 28, the king asked her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "The woman said to me, 'Give your son that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him. And on the next day I said to her, 'Give your son that we may eat him,' but she had hidden him." So there's a famine going on, and these people, I'm not judging these women for this. We have no idea what it's like to starve to death and what people will go to, what extents they will go to. This isn't about that. This is about a God that at the whim of Elisha would blind an entire army, miracle on miracle on miracle, just to deceive them, but won't provide enough food for his own people to keep them from eating their babies and tricking each other into eating their babies. I talk all the time about how much text is used to describe things like a temple versus an abolishment of slavery, but how much of God's miraculous power is used, throwing stones from heaven, tricking people, making people blind, moving rivers, but he can't feed his own people. I think it shows either how unreal all of this is, how incompetent God is, or where his priorities are. Miracles for war, destruction, and death, not miracles for life and children. We'll kill them with bears. We'll let their mothers eat them. But I'm going to blind those soldiers over there to show my power. Look at not just what he's allowing, but what he's preventing, where he intervenes and where he does not. Speaking of deception and how okay God is with this, I want to point out something really interesting. So I mentioned before that around chapter 10, Jehu takes over as king, and he's getting rid of all of the people that would have been against him or that were related to Ahab, and it is done through an immense amount of bloodshed and deception. There's a whole thing with sending letters and getting people to do these things behind people's back. It's chapters and chapters. I'm not going to explain all of it, but just know that it's horrendous, it's unfair, it's awful. It goes and reaches people that had nothing to do with King Ahab or Jezebel in the first place, and listen to his conversation with God here. So this is in 10:30. And the Lord said to Jehu, "Because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." If that's not God taking credit for deception, murder, bloodshed, etc., I don't know what is. What is right in my eyes, what my heart wanted to be done. Disgusting. But even God can't keep it together for Jehu. The next verse. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. And so he loses that. What's the point of these promises? He doesn't keep any of them, but always blames it on the sin of the individual. And all he did, by the way, was continue with his murder and political assassinations. It just wasn't the ones God wanted. How confusing for Jehu. I want to cover a few more, but I want to speed it up here a little bit. In 2 Kings 20:1-11, originally God tells Hezekiah through a prophet he's going to die, and then he doesn't. He gives him 15 more years. This inconsistency with prophecy is my big question. If a prophet says something will happen and then it doesn't for 15 years, can you turn around, call it a blessing from God that he gave Hezekiah an extra 15 years and still fulfilled the prophecy? These are the kinds of games we will see played out and extrapolated on a huge scale in the New Testament to make so many prophecies work. 2 Kings 21:10-15, we see God just punishing Israel because of King Manasseh, but Manasseh goes on to repent, and so we have a real inconsistency with God's divine justice. Same thing in 2 Kings 24:20, where he allows Babylon. Again, we see that it is through God that this is happening. Why now? Why not before? Where is the consistency? We have kings here who are trying to do better, like Josiah, who are repenting, who want to get back on the law. Why now and not during the 20 kings in a row of complete idol worship? We could go on here. This book, despite my overview, is filled with murder, deceit, all at the hands of God, not of just unjust kings, just different time frames of when God likes something and when he does not. Child death is rampant here in this book. And where I've been struggling the most, I think, is covering all of these New Testament verses about the commands of Jesus and hearing all of the excuses about It's really about the heart of the matter. It's really about trusting the nature and character of God. And then I come back and I'm doing these secular Bible study episodes where we see the heart of the matter, what God cares about, God's actual character and nature. And to say it doesn't add up is me at an absolute loss of words for the total inconsistency of the idealized concept of who God is, what he stands for, and that he's good. I can't find a shred of evidence that God is good. So that's where we will leave it today. Thank you for watching. I hope this has still been interesting and entertaining and educational, considering we covered so much of it in 1 Kings. So thanks again. I'll shut up. Have a wonderful day. And until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tier Iconoclast patrons, Shawn Skaggs and Jason Rollins, and my atheist advocate patron, Jarrod Nichols, for their incredible generosity. Also, a big shout out to my secular scholar patrons, of which we have some new ones. All other patrons are listed in the description of each video. Please consider joining this great group if you enjoy these videos or believe in my mission. Thanks, and have a great day.